Welcome to the In Search of More podcast. I am your host, Eli Nash. Join me weekly on my quest for more from myself and more from this world. We'll see you on the other side. All right, welcome, Natalie.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. I'm sitting here with Natalie Ginsberg, the Global Impact Officer at MAPS. MAPS, again, stands for?
The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
Psychedelic Studies. And mostly what it studies is MDMA.
So since its founding in 1985, it has focused on developing MDMA-assisted therapy for the treatment of PTSD through the FDA process. But now Lycos, which is spun off from MAPS, is the entity moving that forward. And MAPS.org, as a nonprofit, is continuing to do education, research, policy reform on actually all psychedelics.
Got it. What's considered psychedelics? Because some like diehards, like the natural medicines won't consider MDMA a psychedelic
Totally.
at all.
It's a great question. And the word psychedelic means mind manifesting. It was coined by Aldous Huxley in conversation with Gordon Wasson. And basically, there are certain, chemical definitions that certain people abide by, but we at MAPS think of it in this greater process of mind manifesting. So we even include breath work to be a psychedelic process. Cannabis we consider psychedelic. And honestly, I've worked at MAPS for a decade, and I've heard the most people have bad trip stories from eating a cannabis edible more than from acid or mushrooms or anything like that. So I think it's interesting to kind of expand our understanding of what that means. With MDMA, it's much more rare for people to have visions or kind of the trippier parts that people think of with this psychedelic, but there's really profound openness and ability to bring things up that have been suppressed, and other psychedelic qualities increase in dopamine and oxytocin and different elements like that. So there isn't one official definition, but what it actually means is mind manifesting.
Right.
Psyche, soul, mind manifesting.
But in terms of the mind manifesting, maybe some will associate that with the hallucinations. But
Totally, and I think that is one of the most unique characteristics of some of these other psychedelic experiences. But it's really important to remember that people have a very wide range of experiences.
That's true.
And for me personally, I actually rarely have visions or hallucinations, even though I've sat with iboga, ayahuasca dozens of times, all different medicines. And I do sometimes, have things that appear, but just I think the general public is really interested in this idea of visions and things, but some of the most profound experiences from psychedelic processes are just kind of a knowing or a perspective shift or a compassion for a family member or yourself, or just feeling of being connected, which can show up in metaphorical images, absolutely, and does, and is quite cool when it does. And I've heard the coolest stories over a decade, from people sharing different visions and things, but yeah, that's not the only part of the psychedelic experience.
Right, that's true. I've had very few ayahuasca experiences where I've had visions, actually. Yeah, most are. Like you described, just a knowing.
Yeah.
The visions are cool, scary, but cool also.
Cool. And I'm actually, as I'm saying that, remembering one of the kind of most strong visions I had was actually just after I had fasted on the day kind of, it was the week before Pesach starts. I had that fast and hadn't smoked cannabis in a while, and then I smoked at the end of the fast and had that was some of the most interesting visions I had. I saw the word chai just written everywhere, Magin David kind of in pattern with each other, just everywhere also, and then kind of felt it in my body. Anyway, it was a really beautiful, just as I was saying, I never have visions. I'm well, there are definitely sometimes I have.
Right. And then you gave an example of something that many people don't consider a psychedelic. So I get it. So I've had the first, of these medicine groups, right, ayahuasca, mushrooms, peyote, San Pedro, any of it that I worked with was actually MDMA. And I think I did maybe 3, maybe 4 sessions with it. Really profound. Then some people do the mixes, MDMA followed by mushrooms. And I'm trying to think. So I have a couple of just observations from my own experience, and I want to know, you've been researching this for a few years. Is number one, I felt like compared to, say, ayahuasca, right? Where ayahuasca, not that I'm encouraging someone to do it over and over, right? There's a idea you get the message, hang up the phone, right? You don't have to keep going back necessarily. And then integration is important as well. But I didn't feel like a cap on the experience is necessary for me. It's like, okay, if I feel the need to go, then I'll go and do another one. But MDMA had a quality that was so predictable in some sense. Like there was a certain goodness of it that was so predictable that I felt after a few, like, I'm done. I don't need that anymore. I describe it as a hug from the universe, which I think not everyone can benefit from, but some people really, really desperately need. And after a few of them, it's like, okay, good. Now explore some of these medicines that maybe have the opportunity to show purpose and direction, and et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about that?
I think, thanks for sharing those experiences. And I think it's hard to make like one clear pronouncement for everyone. I do think, our protocols, or Lycos protocols, include 3 MDMA therapy sessions, and that's enough to help people no longer qualify as having PTSD after having it for years. So I think what you're speaking to, like there's this like kind of deepness, profoundness of the work that you can kind of get to and then work on other things, is something that our research supports. Anecdotally, I have heard people, over a few years, maybe they do it a few times and maybe a few years later they return to it. I've heard couples who might use it once or twice a year regularly as a way of like kind of keeping in alignment.
Yeah.
So it's hard to pronounce like definitely one or the other, but certainly MDMA also is not something we recommend taking like frequently in any way, because it does have some different impacts than something like ayahuasca. But I will say for ayahuasca though, I know many people and understand this kind of finding a rhythm, maybe like every 6 months or a year, kind of going on like a tune-up or alignment or spiritual connection. And I have seen some people who kind of go too much also. I mean, I don't want to use it too much as a judgment, but seeing people continue to go back and back,
Oh, for sure.
every week, every few weeks.
No question.
And finding it's like instead of doing the integration work, they're just kind of continuing to go to that spiritual space without doing the work to bring it back to the everyday life. So I do see people have like not ideal relationships with all of these different medicines, but it is much more about the relationship than like the physiological effect or something of addiction,
Right. So I was saying something else. Of course, people misuse ayahuasca, but ayahuasca felt like something to me that I would go back to for the rest of my life. Whatever that meant. Could be every couple of years. I have no idea what it's like. I mean, we're still early in our relationship, right? We're several years in only, so I don't know how it will progress, but it's something like I can imagine myself wanting to go back 50, 60, 70 years old and say, hey, there's something for me here. Whereas with MDMA, you actually brought up the one use case that's still on my mind, which is me and my wife having an experience together. And maybe from there's a more common use case. But after my 4th experience, I felt like, I think it was a 4th one, that I felt like it was extra. I didn't need that. And so maybe it's interesting, the 3 and the 4, but that's what I meant. Not that someone can misuse MDMA and not something else, but there was the
With
completion
MDMA.
of it. I was like, okay, I'm done with that medicine. I'm good with what it can give me. That was what I meant.
Yeah, I think I have heard multiple people have similar experiences, and so I think there is something there. And I've heard people that are finding more and more benefit continuing with it in different, maybe people who've experienced different types of trauma that need a bit more ongoing support, maybe spreading it out once or twice a year for a few years instead of doing like a few sessions closer together. I mean, these are all things that we don't really know yet because we haven't been able to research, and I just kind of am reporting on what people may share with me in my work. But yeah, I do think couples work is the thing I've heard most regularly for years, and I'm inspired to share a really sweet story. I met this amazing college student that I guess I won't, identify her in any other ways, but she, shared with me that her parents once a year would take MDMA together always, and the whole family would know because everyone in the family would get these like hilarious calls from them being like, we just love you so much and we're so grateful and this is why you're so amazing. And they're like, oh, this is their MDMA day again. But it was really sweet to hear that, and this young girl is amazing. She actually does really cool work with like in Jewish community, and so that just was, I appreciated hearing that anecdote and seeing how it informed the raising of a child. But yeah, I think MDMA has unique qualities for facilitating conversations that other substances might be a little trickier with.
Right. So, okay, so now I guess we're diving deeper into the protocol. That's the protocol of MDMA, meaning it's not take MDMA, it's have conversations under MDMA.
So MDMA therapy that Lykos is, researching through the FDA process, that's set up with 2 therapists and 1 participant. And the participant can go back and forth between conversations and processing and internal work. And they're offered eye shades and headphones, and they're invited to kind of go inside and listen to their inner healing intelligence is what the language is. So I've been really lucky to watch actually a lot of these video sessions. And for the first hour, 2 hours, people are usually lying there internal. Some are kind of moving around a little or laughing or making sounds. Some people are totally still. And then eventually at some point in the session, usually people sit up and take off their eye shade and start talking or processing or revisiting something. It's really interesting because often it's something that they didn't expect that comes up first. Someone is maybe a veteran and expects to be processing trauma from, the war in Afghanistan, and instead the first thing that comes up is early childhood trauma of like a parent, hitting them, or sexual abuse they had repressed or something like that. And so it's really interesting when you let that kind of inner healing intelligence, as the protocol says, guide the process, that unexpected things that kind of get to the root source of a lot of the trauma can emerge. And then that is a back and forth where the 2 therapists are kind of holding space and allowing the person to process that. And that's like a 6 to 8 hour session. And then there are many sessions before and after, just without any MDMA, just getting to know the person, prepare them for the session, and then integrate, of course, after.
So how much of that you think is, okay, we have to package something for the FDA that would make sense for them, or the science really backs this method up?
So MAPS, is a nonprofit, and we were developing this research before Lykos. So our goal was maximizing the outcome. And often with pharmaceutical companies who are obliged to focus on maximizing profit, they'll actually look to reduce cost and say what's a good outcome we can get that's not the maximized.
Right.
And so an example of that is that many other companies developing psychedelics were trying to completely remove therapy, or at least one person who's not a trained therapist, or these things. And we are like, no, we actually believe having 2 therapists help someone process with such high levels of trauma is really needed. So in that way, our research was really strong. So for some context, our research showed that 2/3 of people who entered the study with PTSD, when they left the study, no longer qualified as having PTSD. And for a comparison, the only other psychiatric approved drugs for PTSD are Zoloft and Paxil, and they're around 50% effective in reducing symptoms, not in eliminating. So it's like a completely different ball game. So the research, I think, I would say, does support that, but there's also other ways to do, to understand how it can help. There's just this first group MDMA study for veterans starting in the Portland VA, and now MAPS Israel, which is an independent nonprofit that MAPS has collaborated with, is developing a group study for survivors of October 7th. 3 different groups, people who survived the Nova Rave, people who survived the Kibbutz massacre, and actually soldiers who survived October 7th, like the attacks that day.
Got it.
Sorry.
What's with the emphasis on PTSD? I mean, there are many different kinds of problems.
Great question. So there are many reasons why PTSD was chosen. I can speak a little to the MAP strategy, and I can speak a little to how I understand it. Maybe I'll start with part of my understanding is that trauma is the root of so many other mental struggles. Things like addiction, the chances of you developing addiction is greatly, greatly increase if you have early childhood trauma.
Right.
Even physiological difficulties can be connected to trauma as well. So by addressing PTSD, for me,
So you feel like it's more inclusive?
it's more inclusive and more connected. It like shares kind of clusters of symptoms. Like for depression, there's a lot of shared symptoms with PTSD. It's not the same, but like
Right.
it has overlap. Anxiety as well is really a big part. PTSD is a cluster of symptoms that have a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression, disassociation, other trouble sleeping. So in these clusters of symptoms can be alleviated. I think we can explore if that could be connected to other things. I'll also say that Rick, our founder, Rick Doblin, always talks about choosing a sympathetic population in the U.S. as a strategy, and understanding that Americans, and especially American politicians, view PTSD and veterans is, more sympathetic than, unfortunately, how they might see people addicted to opiate use.
Right, exactly.
So that was also a strategic decision of maybe people would be more open to understanding this work and then could understand how it could apply elsewhere. But kind of once we started doing that work, it was also really clear that though veterans kind of dominate a lot of public conversations around PTSD, there are actually much higher rates of PTSD in groups that are like most socially marginalized in society. And I mean, as Jewish community, I'm sure we have a sense of that even intergenerationally, the trauma we experience or the everyday feeling of maybe not being safe. So that's kind of levels of trauma as well. So I think that's kind of that we see things with a trauma lens, but that's not to say we're not deeply interested in also studying other contexts. And, we are developing couple study, conflict resolution studies, so other
use cases,
and we're very interested in like a wide variety of use cases. And I'll say that you ask about the focus on PTSD, but actually outside of MAPS, there hasn't been that much research on psychedelics with PTSD.
I meant MDMA with PTSD, that combination,
Yeah. And I can speak to why that was paired together.
Right.
But I will say in the psychedelic field in general, there's a lot of research around depression because it's also a huge market. But I would love to see people also studying a wider variety of things instead of just kind of the same population.
Right. And the expectation is to get the FDA approval this year, right?
That's the hope. Yeah, in August.
And that would just be for PTSD, or it would be?
That would be for MDMA for PTSD. Yeah.
Got it. And that's the only use case they expect it to be approved for?
By the FDA, yes. But
once it's approved, I think like doctors can make decisions to use it off label or stuff like that.
Yeah, that would be possible, but we're just the Lycos research is just focused on MDMA for PTSD.
Right. The reason why I think it limits it is because not everyone associates what they're dealing with PTSD.
Totally. Right. And I think that's where it will be an interesting part of the post-approval work, because even now a lot of what MAPS does is actually education around PTSD and trauma. And I think, as you rightly point out, many people don't understand their own experiences of trauma, and actually a lot of PTSD diagnoses exclude certain people. Like, for example, Black Americans are less likely to be diagnosed with PTSD even if they have it, because certain criterion don't connect in the same, don't resonate.
Such as?
So PTSD is diagnosed based on things that are called like criterion A or criterion B events, like a really big traumatic experience that usually has to be identified, which even in of itself is kind of a problematic way of thinking about it. When you're living in an ongoing state of trauma, like there might not be like one huge experience, but if every day you're afraid when you go to the market there's going to be a suicide bomber, or if you're living in Gaza that you're not going to get food that day, that's everyday trauma, and it doesn't really even capture that, or intergenerational trauma. But even ignoring
complex
that,
PTSD, I think they call it.
Right, yeah, complex PTSD. But then with a criterion A event, for example, it's about when you're really in fear of your life. And so a Black American being pulled over by a police officer, that can be a very legitimate fear for their life, but that might not be counted as something listed as a criteria, like a police stop. That might not be qualified. Understood. So those are just the kind of ways it's not fully adaptive and expansive to meet a range of different communities. So a lot of people are underdiagnosed with it. And I talk a lot about cultural trauma and historical trauma, and I think what people are experiencing right now, even watching what's happening in Israel and Gaza and Palestine, there's a level of trauma of watching the news, of experiencing that vicarious trauma is actually a word for it. I think people are understanding more and more what trauma might mean on different levels.
So PTSD is diagnosed by the event, not what's going on in a person?
It's a combination. So it's like a cluster of symptoms that you have, but then you also have to identify a criterion A or B event that kind of connects to the symptoms.
Interesting, because some people don't have that event, even if the event exists. And I'm thinking of two people. I'll share one story of this guy I know who's going through a very, very difficult time. Definitely suicidal ideation, if not past that. What he shared with me was suicidal ideation, but it felt like it was more than just thoughts. Like there was some, I don't know, more tangible, like planning or something. Mm. And I share with him my experiences, going back a few years ago. I share with him my experiences with medicine, and he had an MDMA experience, and he had a vision of him crying as a child. He grew up in a very large family, him crying as a child, and his mother putting her pillow over his face in order to quiet him. And it matched up a lot with what he was experiencing, which was he was going through something difficult, and he had a very difficult time asking for help, like saying anything to anyone, which kind of matched up with that experience. But he didn't have that memory before because it was a very young memory. So if he could have walked in and said, hey, I'm dealing with all these symptoms, right? Depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation and oversensitivity stuff, whatever it was, like those symptoms possibly could have matched PTSD, but the event wasn't in his conscious memory. But then when he went and took the medicine, then all of a sudden that came back to him.
It's exactly the example. And how often those things emerge, or people might not have remembered that memory, or even if they had the memory, they didn't actually realize how it imprinted on them.
Right, that's another one, yes.
Yeah. That's, to me, one of the more magical parts of watching these experiences. People remember, revisit, things that had been repressed. And to be clear, I think that repression can be really helpful to a certain point, right? Like as a kid, you kind of need to keep going and not understand all of the levels of that. But then as you get older, then it starts to weigh on you in a way that does not serve you anymore. And that's when it kind of shows up with PTSD symptoms or anxiety symptoms. And hopefully people have access to ways of healing them with or without MDMA therapy that they can excavate and process and reintegrate them.
Right. Yeah, that's why when you started sharing as PTSD, like almost as inclusive because it captures many other things, I reacted the way I did because my experience has been that when someone gets into the work, they see everything as traumatizing. It's like, oh, I was probably traumatized by that, that's traumatized. Totally. And we appreciate how big the small things can be. But before that, someone will say, oh, I was never sexually abused. Like, what trauma do I have?
Totally.
I don't know. Your parents were divorced. I mean, that could have affected you a lot, right?
Hugely.
Yeah.
And I think there's also the conversation of like relative trauma is something that I, as a social worker, like a lot of the work I was exposed to kind of when I was younger was like, well, I didn't experience any trauma, nothing like that. And then being able to hold space for, like, as you said, what are your experiences as a child? You're not holding the whole world, but your individual experience is going to shape you no matter what. And like to be able to give ourselves that space and grace to have compassion for our experiences, and you can hold it in context, but that trauma to a child, it's not relative in that same kind of way.
Right. This may sound a little insensitive, but I'll make the point anyway, is I feel like the sexual abuse I went through as a child was a gift to me because it made it very clear that I had this something to work on. Versus if I look back at my life without that experience, I probably could have ignored a lot. And the sexual abuse came, oh, wow, there was something major that happened to me. And it wasn't until years later that I realized the sexual abuse had very little to do with the way I was affected. It was the context that sexual abuse was allowed to emerge in. That's what affected me, not the abuse itself. Not to downplay it, but it would have happened one time if I was in a healthy context, or not, right? Not over 3 years. I would have said to someone something when it did happen, not 15 years later, right? So the context was more important than the event, but it was the event that allowed me to feel comfortable enough to say, okay, I'm fine, but there's this event that happened to me that I need to deal with. And then I realized I'm not fine.
That's
I'm not fine at all.
profound. And that you also had the space in your journey to first process yourself and then recognize it's this broader thing.
Right.
That it's systemic. That so often all of our trauma is from this broader system, but it's a lot harder for people to trace that back. Usually it's hard enough to understand what happened to ourselves and hold space for healing that, but then to be like, oh, but wait, it's actually bigger than this, which is bigger than that. That's really hard for a lot of people to hold, but I believe it's such a core part of the healing also. And it's something that actually really motivated me to get into psychedelic work, because I saw so often when people were unraveling their own trauma, they saw how it was connected to this cultural systemic trauma, and my prayer is that it will help us kind of unravel that at the bigger levels. I've seen this in even an example, we were talking about military stuff sometimes,
Just want to try to get the mic in front of you as much as possible.
So
you can move the mic to you, but
okay.
Yeah.
So an example from watching some video sessions of MDMA therapy was a veteran processing the trauma of actually perpetrating violence, which comes up a lot, which is really interesting. Moral injury, it's described as. But she was saying, she was in Iraq, and she was like, there are these kids coming at me, I had to shoot at them, I was protecting us, and then she kind of goes to this other voice, and she was like, why was I in a position where shooting at children was protecting me? And then she was like, oh, well, I was just trying to protect my country and protect my family. And she's like, but was my country making the right choice? And it was like this really beautiful back and forth where she basically got to being like, I'm not a bad person. I did these things to help people and to be good, but I can see the systems at play can be dangerous and violent, and separate herself. So for me, that's kind of another example of this ability for people to process their own trauma and then separate themselves from these broader systems that are generating more and more trauma for so many people and making it impossible for so many people to heal and break out of the cycles.
Right. So let's use that as a segue into Israel, Gaza, Israel-Palestine, this conversation, because I know it's on your mind and on your heart now. So let's go there.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, as someone who does see so many things through a trauma lens, that's really the main way I can even begin to understand what's happening right now. And, there's just amount of intergenerational trauma among Jewish people from thousands of years, Palestinian intergenerational trauma from, since the founding of Israel and even before. There's just deep, powerful grief that I see hasn't had the space to be processed and healed, and then seeing it come out in violent forms, in ways of fear, where I just see people acting from a place of feeling genuinely unsafe, which makes sense based on history and experience, so it's not like some illogical feeling. But when people act from that, we're not safe, everyone wants to kill us, then that allows people to make decisions that are more short-sighted and kind of create more unsafety, how I see it, and more violence that do not help in the longer term. But so few people are able to see it through this trauma lens. And, we see this crazy rise in anti-Semitism, for example, and, Israel is this evil colonial aggressor, and very little understanding of the real experience of Jewish people around the world. And, people might know about the Holocaust, but even that, the education is actually really upsettingly
So how do you
low.
think that plays into what's going on in Israel?
I think that a lot of the politicians and the Israeli people, first of all, there are really high rates of PTSD in Israel. Besides the fact that many people everyone has to serve, the experience of just living in a place where you feel everyone around you wants to kill you or doesn't want you to exist, of knowing people who died in suicide attacks and being scared when you go to them. I'm sure you've been to it. You walk through security, through everything you go to. So that level of lack of safety coupled with the severe segregation between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, it's very rare for people to genuinely know each other, to be in real space with each other besides kind of smaller interactions. So I think that fear coupled with that separation creates some ways of voting and empowering certain forces that right now that I don't think are, serving Israel.
You're saying on both sides or on Israel's side?
Both sides. I was speaking a bit more to the Israel side right now,
right.
But certainly, similarly, before this started, Hamas was not popular. I have a number of friends from Gaza. They were no fans of Hamas, of course. But as Israel continues to, destroy all of Gaza, bomb so many innocent people, hospitals, then Hamas they're fighting, so the support increases, not because people are so aligned with Hamas, right? But
so you feel like the support increases for Hamas through this process?
That's what the polls are showing right now.
Really? Even though, they won't trace it back to this being initiated by a Hamas event?
It's kind of a mix, people recognized how ridiculous, Hamas knew that Israel would retaliate, right? So I've seen a lot of blame placed there, but just at this point, the way that, it's become such a binary, unfortunately. And I think when one side is attacking and acting with such impunity as a Gazan, that's how I understand the polls, that incomprehensible trauma that Gazans are experiencing and Palestinians experiencing right now, every day, that doesn't give this same space of stepping back. How are we gonna, make peace? It's how can I not die in this exact moment? And similarly, I think Israelis actually have that feeling right now, and so many people are in Gaza of we really need to protect right now. We can't even, think too far ahead and just tomorrow. If we're not in Gaza, then what about the hostage? There's this very I just see it a lot based in fear, which I see connected a lot with trauma, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that because a lot of the leadership in Israel are either traumatized or voted in by traumatized people, then they're acting in a way that's coming from fear and coming from trauma.
Yes,
Okay,
and I'll
if
say
they
even,
weren't, then what?
And I'll maybe add one other piece to that. I do think that when you don't heal cycles of violence, you recreate them. And even, for example, with sexual abuse, as I'm sure you're familiar, that the majority of people who are sexual abusers have experienced sexual abuse themselves. Though a really important statistic is
Not majority, but.
Oh, really? I thought that I would trust that you would know.
Right. So I'll tell you, the data is very skewed on this, and I'll give you one fact from me that kind of upends this idea of abusers becoming, the victims becoming abusers, is that most victims are female and most abusers are male. So it doesn't, why aren't females abusing more if that's what leads to it?
I would say
What they
that
believe from the research, because there is some research that shows it, is that when someone is caught and arrested, right, that's where these abusers are usually coming from. In order to garner sympathy, they say that they were abused as well, but they can be lying, right? So it's not 100%.
Interesting. Yeah, and I might just add though that a lot fewer men are able to come forward
Yes,
with
much harder,
abuse,
yes.
and also a lot fewer people report women abuse.
A lot fewer people.
Report sexual abuse from a woman. I have heard a lot more stories in recent years of abuse, but it's not something, or people don't call it abuse.
Right, people don't react to it in the same way.
Or
That
they
is
don't
true.
process
It's
it
not
as
processed
abuse.
in the same way.
Someone shared recently that a sister, when he was young, but he's like, oh, that wasn't abuse. That was just, she got me bad at it. And I was like, oh, that would be considered abuse. But there's just, so I'm not disagreeing. I'm just adding, it's so complex to.
Right, super complex. The data's, it's right. The
Yeah.
data's
And
certainly messy, but what's definitely true is that most people who are abused don't go on to abuse.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that is definitely true.
The one study I saw which had is that in the average population, let's say 1 in 4 men are abused. And in the population of abusers, 1 in 3 are abused. Right? So it's up, but it's not like this massive
Okay, well, I
difference.
appreciate learning this because I wasn't so familiar with like those gradations, and it's important. I did know that the majority of people who are survivors do not continue on,
Right.
and that feels like the most important statistic. But what I had understood is that there were cycles involved for the people who were abusing. But I guess regardless of that example,
Yeah, I'm sensitive to it.
No, it's
I'll tell you why I
important.
am.
It's
just
important to get it right.
sake, because I won't react like this to too many things, is that idea kept me silent for a long time about my abuse, meaning the thought that if I shared it with someone, they would think that I was an abuser, like that.
Yeah.
It's like, that idea gets shared often. So I'm like, okay, I can't say it to someone because the second I say it, there's like, I'm already on the defensive.
Thank you for
So.
sharing that. I will say first of all, because you shared that, I'm not going to use that example again, but I will say whenever I've shared it, I have also shared, and the vast majority of survivors do not go out so that's
Right.
I have always made sure to say that, but regardless, I don't want to add to any like stigma or blocking people from
Right.
feeling comfortable coming forward. So thank you for sharing that. I
On the
appreciate
other
it.
side, though, is that I have, through different work I've done, and everything I'm sharing with you is dated because I was very into this subject probably up until 2016. And 2016, I got engaged. 2017, I got married. And I knew that I had to almost completely exit from the conversation of sexual abuse if I was going to have children, raise a family. It's just a very, very tough conversation to be seeped in. So there may be new research, there may be other stuff that discounts some of what I'm saying, but at the time that I was steeped into the subject, this was important to me. This is what I came across. Now, one thing I would say is that having spoken, this is anecdotal, but I spoke to a number of people who admitted or were caught sexually abusing a child, and definitely seemed like there was a lot of physical abuse in their life. Like, it didn't always, in the stories, it felt less sexual. The abuse was, they say everything's about sex except for sex. Sex is about power. Have you heard that?
I have.
So
Interesting.
and some of it seems to be about that. So there is a cycle of abuse that's happening, but there's a way that somehow gets channeled into sex. Sex is almost like a catch-all for a lot of different things, right? It can be a channel for anger. It can be a channel for love. It could be a channel for pleasure. It could be like so many things can get like
Power, as you
right,
said.
and exactly. Well, that's what was anger. Where I was going with that. So it's able to harness and channel a lot of different emotions and things. And it does seem that sometimes when people are physically abused or humiliated in that way and feel really weak, then that can come out in that way. I don't know that it's always about
Having previous.
I would say it's not that many. Let's say I've spoken to 10 people who've abused children and admitted to it, and I was able to have a conversation with them. And I in my mind, I categorized them into two. Some were in this like strange power dynamic where the humiliation of another person, and that was best expressed through sex, through humiliating them sexually, but it wasn't actually a sexual drive.
Interesting.
And I think like where this can be like studied and researched would be if a man was chemically castrated, right? Would it change that behavior? And according to this theory, it wouldn't, right? For someone who's operating from that. And then others just seem to be emotionally stunted adults who are operating, let's say, at 10, 11, 12 years old, who are attracted to someone who is 10, 11, 12 years old because that's where they were. They were just 10-year-olds in, 40-year-old bodies or 50-year-old bodies. So those are, in my mind, for a number of people, of the two ways I've categorized people who've abused children. But again, it's anecdotal, but it's probably more anecdotal than most people get access to.
Yeah, I would definitely trust your assessment of that. That's really interesting to hear that breakdown. And yeah, I definitely can understand, envision the person you're describing as a kind of emotionally, like someone who's emotionally a younger age and I had understood that as experiencing some kind of also trauma at that age sometimes can like help lead to.
Sure, yeah, they can get
that.
stuck. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, certainly a lot of things can be viewed through the lens of trauma.
Yeah, I know. I'd make everything through the lens
Right.
of trauma.
You can almost view anything through any lens if we want to, if we get there. I don't want to go too political with it, but I just kind of have to ask the question. So you feel Israel should be doing something different now, and that's a trauma, or it's more upstream that these things would have been resolved and there wouldn't be the need for this kind of
both.
tech?
Both, I think. Yeah, I think upstream, Israel could have made different decisions in different ways, and this is not only blaming Israel. Like, I see that there's blame. I think there's enough blame to go all around.
When there's a war, we've all screwed up in some way. So
Totally.
Right, you have my agreement there. I'm not sure that Israel could do anything different today. I mean,
Today, I would say that the war in Gaza, I have great fear. I know is already creating so much pain, violence, and trauma among Gazans and people watching around the world, and among Israelis being forced to go do this really brutal combat that is really traumatizing for them, especially when there's such high death tolls. Like, that's one of the things that causes highest rates of PTSD, when you're having to commit things that are, that create moral injury. So in that way, and, knowing things like getting the hostages back, for me, it would be really a priority. And, the most hostages were returned after different negotiations, and now they're being, they're vulnerable to bombings. And so I guess in those ways, not to get too political, but I would say that I feel this energy of like, we can't stop until that, like, there's this, it feels like very hyper vigilant, like that's like a PTSD symptom that comes up, rather than like, what's the longer play here that could serve to protect, Jewish people living in land or Israel for longer than right now, creating something that's very, I see as unstable, like outside, creating a lot of that violence on all sides, if that makes sense. And I guess the reason I brought up that example that I'm so glad we went on the tangent about, because I'm really grateful to have learned from you. But I do see that Jewish people have experienced, the Holocaust comes up a lot, but that is just one thing. Like, Jewish people have experienced trauma, oppression, ethnic cleansing, genocide in multiple, like almost everywhere that we've lived.
For sure.
The majority of the places that we've experienced it are actually in the Christian Europe and Russia. And though, Jews did live as a dhimmi status, or not as equal citizens in much of the Arab world in North Africa and the Middle East, Jews did live with much more safety and abundance, and like weren't like kicked out of their land every like generation or two.
Well, that was up until 1948.
Exactly. Right. But I'm just kind of and then at that point, that's so much of Israel, of course, are people that were kicked out of their lands where they had been living for a longer time than, my ancestors from the Ukraine, they were kicked out every little bits, but my friends that were kicked out of, Iran, Iraq, they had been there for a long time. So there was like this other huge different kind of trauma of betrayal of like, Ashkenazi Jews are like, well, yeah, of course we can never trust people. And then Mizrahi Jews are like, that was like a almost newer trauma in some ways. And so the kind of combination of all of that coming together in a place like Israel, where there's kind of constant wars of you're not safe, you shouldn't be here. I just see that as kind of compounding trauma. It's like we have like thousands of years of trauma that we didn't really have time to fully heal and process, and then we just had to like fight in Israel to protect our everyday experience. So I think and then, because I agree with you, not everything is, trauma. I will say what also breaks my heart is I see that Israel has disconnected a lot of Jewish people and a lot of Israelis from Judaism. Like, because Israel has created very strict parameters around like what is Jewish and isn't Jewish and how certain things operate. That's actually what inspired me to co-found the Jewish Psychedelic Summit, was I had all of these Israeli friends who are super into psychedelics and spirituality. They're like, oh, but I'm not actually Jewish. I'm like, but you are. And they're like, well, actually I'm like Hindu or I'm Buddhist, and I have these mantras, and I'm like, we have that in Judaism, and we have like nigunim. When you sit with ayahuasca, you can use instead of it's the same thing as an ikaro. Like, so to me, that's one of the things I would like to believe is part of also healing this trauma. When we're connected with our spirituality and deep Jewish learnings and teachings and community, I believe that's like a really key part in shifting how we hold that trauma and process it and like move forward with it, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, my experience, my own Judaism has been enriched by psychedelics, but I do want to go back to what you were saying about Israel, that Israel has distanced Jews from Judaism. What do you mean by that?
I think so. I mean that like quite literally, the number of my Israeli friends who literally said they didn't identify as Judaism. They said, I would never have a rabbi perform my wedding because in Israel, you have to have a particular, I think not even a conservative rabbi, just an Orthodox rabbi, right? And I had this Israeli friends come meet some amazing rabbi in the US who is a woman and who is more open. They're like, of course, I would love to have her do my wedding, but that's not even an option in Israel. So I just say I'm not doing a Jewish wedding,
Right.
And I feel in the US, there's a lot more of a bridge of what it means to be Jewish and, what observant means and, what Shabbat means. Of course in Israel, not of course, but Shabbat, gratefully in Israel, is a big part of people's experience, but a lot of people also might not, connect with that spirit. And I know I'm speaking in broad generalities, and a lot of people in Israel are very Jewishly identified, but I see the core of Judaism in so many ways is about reading the text, engaging, being in, havruta, like back and forth, asking questions. Like our Talmud is how many people disagreeing. So the idea that Israel creates this way of like, this is Judaism, this isn't, feels like for me a disconnect for many people who would otherwise be able to identify as Jewish, connect with different practices that they don't feel as
Right.
welcomed into.
I mean, there were a lot of rabbis who were opposed to the Jewish, like the founding of a Jewish state for this reason, is that it kind of mixes politics with
Exactly.
Judaism in a potentially unhealthy way. So some have kind of stayed with that anti-Israel approach, but many have kind of moved past that and say, at the end of the day, you have millions of Jews who live there now, and it's overall been good. But yes, this concern of, because now you have to sit there and define, if there's a Jewish right of return, then who is a Jew, right? And that becomes very, very messy and problematic for a lot of people.
And to be clear, like I think there is an Israel that could exist with many, like a pluralistic kind of Judaism. It's not that it's like either no Israel and Judaism. Like I think there's a big in between. And I know my understanding, you might know better, but at the founding of Israel, like Ben Gurion was like, oh, let the religious people deal with the religion. And instead of, and like kind of gave like pretty religious rabbis the power to like develop the rabbinut and all of that, instead of saying, let's make sure we have representation from like the Reform and from this and from that. And we're building a pluralistic Judaism, because the other thing is so much of the Jewish orthodoxy right now, which again, please check me on this, but I see as, surprise, surprise, coming from some trauma where we're thinking of like Eastern Europe, like the time of, all of the pogroms and all of that trauma where Jews started to dress a certain way, really act in a community. My great-grandmother's lineage is from Medjugorje, where Baal Shem Tov was from, and understanding his teachings about mysticism and community. And like, I see so much of that still alive, but also so much of it feels like there was after this like trauma response of how do we like lock it down and follow it to this T when the energy of it is so open. Go sit in the woods, go talk to people, smoking his pipe. I'd love to know what was in that pipe that Vesh was always smoking. But just seeing literally how people dress in certain religious communities, that's not like an ancient practice, Kippah, yes, is an ancient practice. Like all of those things,
But even not always this, right? Some people wear the the full.
Great point. Yes, but maybe covering ahead, like there's certain elements that are these beautiful ancient practices and certain we've picked up along the way. But I do see some of them, like we're kind of elevating as this is like the truth of Judaism when it's like came from, Eastern Europe at the time of a really difficult time for Jews. Many of these like more calcified traditions. And then when rabbis, from Ethiopia come, they're not even considered real rabbis, or like the difficulty, Jews from different communities have had in Israel, like establishing their legitimacy. So it's like from this deep love of like the fullness and diversity of Judaism, of Jewish people, like outside of even the religion, just the Jewish people, we're comprised of such beautiful different cultures that also have so many overlapping shared spiritual practices. And the fact that we all still share so many literal prayers, like the same freaking words around the world in so many disconnected communities, that like gives me chills. Like there's so much magic in that. And to me, that's something Israel has in this community of people from around the world united by their Judaism. But then it does break my heart when it's like, okay, but actually this is really what Judaism is, and you're not really Jewish. I have a number of patrilineal Jewish friends in the US who are so deep in their neshama Jewish, and they literally are afraid to tell people that they're not Jewish. One of them actually just converted finally because she was like, I just hate to feel made less than when I know I'm Jewish. Like she practices, so it's just these things. And when, by the way, in the Torah, like Judaism did pass through the father too in the Torah,
In what way?
Many of our forefathers before the women, like how did they become Jewish if they weren't, the mothers of our forefathers? They were married,
So not really, right? So you have, let's say, Abraham, right?
Sarah.
Had Sarah as a wife.
Right.
And
Was
Hagar
she Jewish?
as a wife.
Yeah. How does Sarah become?
So the children from Sarah were considered Jewish. The children from Hagar were not.
Right.
At one point, but they weren't even Jewish. I guess the Judaism didn't really start until the Torah was given at Sinai. I guess it was the Hebrew people. They were the Israelites or whatever, right? The Hebrews. And Judaism was at Mount Sinai, I suppose. I'm not sure.
But so my Hebrew name is Rachel Leah. So you could say they kind of birthed the beginning of these tribes of Israel,
Yes.
right? But so Lavan, right? Like, or their parent, like Rachel and Leah's. Oh, I guess mother was, maybe it was Jewish.
It could be they weren't. I mean, obviously at some point they weren't Jewish, right?
So,
but everyone could become Jewish.
Yes.
Right. So that's.
Yeah. I guess that's just my opening. And maybe the story is.
Right, but I don't know that it passed through the father at any point. One thing I do know, I interviewed someone not long ago. His name is Effie Palvanov. We haven't put out the podcast, but he spoke about how, so Judaism has a very funny relationship with conversion. So he spoke about one aspect of it, which is more kind of like, he quoted the Rambam as saying, like, it's kind of very basic. Like, are you willing to reject a polytheistic worldview? Like, do you embrace one creator of the world? And I don't know, maybe one other question, and that's it. Now you're Jewish, versus putting people through a litany of questions. But there's also another part of it is that Abraham, for example, the difference between him, like he's the father of Judaism, so to speak, difference between him and other great people before who found God is that he felt the need to share it. Right? It said he had a tent with four sides, and then people would come and he'd say, I'll give you food, but you got to bless the Creator. Right? So he was on a mission to teach and share and like kind of open his tent to as many people as possible. It was more about a way of life and a teaching than it was lineage. Obviously at that point there was no lineage, right? So it was that. And then it's somewhere, I think in the Talmud it talks about time may have been under the Romans that Jews were sentenced to death if they were found to convert anyone else to Judaism. So it became, I guess, a trauma response, if you want to say, right? To say, okay, if someone comes and says, I want to convert, it can be a test. So put them through hell. Make sure they're real. Make sure they're serious. So they would share all the horrible laws, the most difficult, and are you willing to practice this? And are you willing to practice that? This happens to us, that happens to us. They would ignore them, right? It was only if there was if they knew this person was coming with such sincerity. And we've kind of kept that, which is very different than other religions, which was more open and more sharing. And on the other hand, just for my opinion, it's not worth that much. But in terms of Israel, I think that kind of the definition of being in a state of exile is you don't have pure goods. Like you can't create something and it's good on all sides. Everything comes at a cost. So like, what is Israel supposed to do? Like, is it completely pluralistic? Then every single person is considered Jewish, right? So everyone just makes it up. I'm Jewish, right? So they needed some rules around it. There had to be some parameters. Otherwise, it's just mad chaos because there's many people from many countries which would love to come to a first world society.
Know, in Israel, they are giving certain, like Ugandan Jews a really difficult time, but the Jews from Russia who have like one great grandparent that is like more that they're being invited in because they have tech job. Like, so I hear you, but sadly I'm seeing it practiced in a way that even now is not like as exacting.
Oh, I'm saying it's not ideal, right? So something good like the founding of a Jewish state will also come with a lot of challenges, but there's no necessarily perfect solution. That's what I'm saying. Rudy Rachman was here, and he's extremely passionate about this, where he says, like, you go to Nigeria and you have these people who've been so steadfast in their Judaism, right, tracing it back for literally thousands of years, and they have Torah scrolls from who knows when, and they're considered not Jewish because of some rule, right? So there are some problems that need to be sorted out, for sure. I'm just saying that there isn't like, it's not necessarily an alternative is better. It's a very, very difficult when you start mixing politics with religion.
And something else I wanted to respond to that's interesting, you said Rambam says it's pretty simple, like just have to, believe in one God. And for conversion, that makes sense. But something that I actually really appreciate about Judaism is like, you're Jewish, like you don't have to even believe in God to be Jewish. I mean, that's a core tenet.
Once you are, yes.
Once you are. Yes. And like, though of course it's a core tenet of the religion and like a belief, it's a part of my personal practice, but it's something I really appreciate when, community is like questioning, or like these people that are like, I'm not really Jewish. I'm like, well, you are, whether you say it or not. Like we're a people also. And I think that's part of what's so confusing also for the rest of the world to make sense of. Like we're an ethnicity, but we're also a religion. But now there's a country that's like, it's just quite hard. We don't fit into these neat boxes. Are Jews white who are Ashkenazi, but you're not white because we were killed for being not white. White supremacists don't think we're white, but police officers certainly will treat me as a white person walking down the street and, take care of me. But I travel the world over and people just from looking at my face say, are you Jewish? Never mind my last name, Ginsberg. But so, yeah.
What I would say to this person is both Chabad and anti-Semites will consider you Jewish. So you may not, but you're gonna get harassed either way.
Literally.
I think Sheldon Adelson, right, which besides for his political positions, was a very, very fervent Jew and supporter of Israel, and being Jewish was like a huge part of his identity. And he said what led to it was, I think, an anti-Semitic incident when he was a teenager in the school cafeteria. And he said, hey, if I'm going to be... He didn't identify much with his Judaism at that point, but someone attacked him for it. So he said, okay, if you're going to attack me for it, then I may as well be Jewish. Like if I'm...
Well, so I'm glad you
being identified
brought up
as
that
Jewish.
Story, because that I think helps encapsulate what I was trying to say about like trauma in Israel even. That like, I think a lot of Jewish people and even Israel was founded from this, well, like everyone's going to kill us and say we don't belong and accuse us of being Jews, so we need to like take care of ourselves and stand up in that. But it feels like a lot of it is understandably, like completely get why, but a reaction to that rather than a like, being Jewish is so, what are all the beautiful ways of being Jewish and the beautiful cultures and how would we build in this way? Instead of it's like, well, everyone wants to hate us. How do we protect ourselves and stay safe?
Right.
Which to make extra clear, I understand why that was a necessity, but I see that as part of the cycle that just kind of continues to create more of this violent energy instead of like operating from this more spiritual, spacious place, which of course, I've been blessed to spend a lot of time in the land, and it's very clear. I feel a very strong, palpable, spiritual, energetic, like present, like, I know that exists there. But I just fear that a lot of the political decisions and behaviors come a bit more from the trauma side of Judaism, which frankly has also kept our people together, because that is part of what, don't forget our stories. We've been through this.
100%.
Like, we have to, we made it through all this, and now you're just going to let Judaism go after everything your ancestors survived with. So I think that is a piece of our puzzle, but I'm always thinking, even though I talk about trauma all the time, I'm actually thinking about how to operate.
The solution.
To operate not just from the trauma place, but from the what's next? How can we vision from a place of love, healing, spirituality, connection, and make a better world with less trauma?
Yeah, I've had this thought recently because I've been around kind of Native American healing circles, peyote ceremonies, sweat lodge ceremonies, and just how often you'll sit in ceremony with these men and they'll talk about the trauma of Native Americans. I'm like, why do I want to hear this constantly? The sweat lodge ceremonies, kind of nonstop talking about the people and the way they were oppressed and what happened. And I was kind of reflecting on it the third time I was sitting there for 2 hours with the group who would not stop talking about Native American trauma. And I said, what I thought is that, Native Americans were a lot of people at some point. There aren't many left. So the ones who there were certain messages that kind of kept people in that little group. And that's they're oppressing us. They want to change our names. They want to change our ways. They want to take it away. They want to, bulldoze us. So we need to remember that, and we need to defend from that. And I mean, in the process, they've preserved some of these amazing, amazing, amazing traditions. If we can get a lot of peyote to a lot of the world, this medicine is amazing. Amazing. What a medicine. And they've fought so hard to preserve that. And I'm sure many other ways of life and traditions. And I kind of felt a shared, maybe a shared mission, I would say, with Native Americans in the sense that they said, we're going to allow ourselves to be traumatized like crazy. And it was easy to opt out of the trauma. Just stop being Native American. Right? Just, okay. I mean, one generation in, your kids are in the schools. If someone had a Native American great-grandfather, today their kid's name could be Bob Russell and everything's fine. Right? They don't, it's very, very quick you become into the American system. Same with a lot of Jews. Right? It's very quick you get in there. But some said, no, we're going to allow ourselves to be different. We're going to allow ourselves to be traumatized. We're going to allow ourselves to be abused. For what reason? To preserve our way of life, to preserve, and not only for us, to preserve this way of life for the world, that the world has the benefit of the Torah, these ceremonies, these whatever it is. And in the process, of course, there's a fair amount of trauma. And now there's this unique opportunity to actually work with these traditions and ceremonies and teachings, the gifts that we fought so hard to protect, and now actually get the benefit of it. And not just sit there and protect it, but it can do something for us.
Amen. That really resonates super, super deeply. And something I think about, even this idea of Jews as the chosen people, which can be such a controversial concept for, we're chosen to be a light unto nations. And our experience has been one of so much trauma and persecution. I do suspect part of our being that light is helping people learn how to deal with trauma, or how, kind of being this reflection of all of these experiences and bringing our spiritual tools to heal trauma and process it also as a light. And so that, that's part of my inspiration also with the Jewish psychedelic work, because, you mentioned medicine like peyote, but there are actually medicines mentioned in the Torah that we, have not really engaged with or excavated very much, exploration of things like ketoret, what's in ketoret, this very precious particular incense. And, I'm sure, cannabosium, cannabis is mentioned. And I suspect there's a lot more. We already have so much available right now, but there's even more, I suspect, to be kind of dug into.
So acacia wood, which was what the Mishkan was made from?
Acacia and Syrian rue. Have you sat with them mixed together?
I haven't, no, but...
Wow. Well, it's a really beautiful experience.
Yeah, someone just mentioned to me last week, so that's two. Okay.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to sit with medicine that, when I sat with it, I was in a Jewish space. There was a mixed minyan of 10, co-ed minyan, and we ended up all singing different Hebrew prayers throughout ceremony, and it was just a really powerful, beautiful experience. And I personally do feel really drawn to plants that are in the Torah or from the land, and like what that might look like when people are exploring their own ancestral practices and traditions. And though I know I was just saying that, as a light unto nations, I hope Jews have these tools to share with other people. But I also believe that like if people are able to trace their own lineages and their own traditions, like that's really what's most powerful for us all to kind of connect to our land-based like plant traditions that really almost every community around the world has had if you go back to a certain point. And for me, that there's something extra powerful in singing prayers that my ancestors have chanted for literally thousands of years.
Right.
I mean, there's no compare, like as beautiful as other ceremonies I've been a part of, it's a different feeling. I don't know if you've had that. Have you been in like Jewish ceremony spaces?
I was in a Jewish sweat lodge. I haven't done too many Jewish circles. Like I've kind of kept out of that, but yes, I've been in ceremonies with Jews a number of times, and someone I sat with a fair amount with ayahuasca, because he was working with Jews a lot, started kind of bringing in, even though he's not Jewish, started bringing in Jewish music. And it was nice. It was certainly nice, but I haven't done the minions or farbrengans like that. I've kind of kept my medicine as healing. Okay, like I'm going in for healing. I'm not going in for...
Makes sense. And I know there's levels of different people having different experiences with Judaism and some traumatic experiences. And
Sure.
like, I think those spaces have to be very intentional and careful, but it is something I'm really passionate about, creating those spaces, because people, unlike you, a lot of the Jews that I'm around did not grow up with a lot of touch points and observance. So when they're going deep into a spiritual space, for me, I feel like very called to help create options where they can be connecting with Judaism and not having to like seek other cultural spiritual practices, and also not be like re-traumatized. Or I've had experiences where therapists have asked me to like let go. Well, they're like, what if you just let go of your Jewish identity? And I was like, absolutely not. I was like, I couldn't even if I wanted to, but I don't want. I was like so in the middle of ceremony, and if someone else hadn't felt that strong, and they like, what if they were just like, okay, and I don't know, and maybe that's part of their journey, but for me, it's important that there's space where you can work within your Jewish identity. It was about pain and trauma. It was
Right.
like I was feeling my womb being connected to thousands of years of Jewish women's wombs. And then I was thinking of Rachel and Leah, and I was like, there's so much power and wisdom in this, like womb to womb to womb. But there's of course so much pain and trauma, and I was like, feeling how I can kind of hold them both together. And this woman was like, what if you just let go of the pain? I'm like, no, I'm Jewish. That's part of the thing. And she was like, well, what if you just let go of being Jewish? I'm like, no, like it's transmuting it. Like it's not weighing me down, but
Right.
how do I like transmute it? And that when I've shared that with other Jewish therapists, most of them are like, yeah, I would understand more of what you're working with. And this woman is a wonderful therapist. It's a cultural understanding or what
Right.
that means, and how to say just let go of being Jewish is like when, as you talked about, many of our ancestors have fought and survived for so
it's
long for
ingrained.
that.
It's a big group that kind of whittled down. There's certain...
Yeah, and there's like just this like I
Yes.
would be like I couldn't even if I wanted to like I don't
Right.
want to, but yeah.
So has medicine enriched your Judaism, or was it like this before?
I would say it was enriched, but I always have had a deep like soul kind of connection. I grew up conservative but I went to Hebrew school like 3 times a week, but I went to secular school in New York City.
Right.
I wouldn't say our family was particularly observant, went to shul for the high holidays, but as I deepened both my own spiritual exploration and also my knowledge of like other plant-based indigenous practices, I was like, wait, like I have my own versions of these things, like, and what is that? Not my own, but my lineage of these, and also actually in a lot of my exploration of like anti-racism and decolonization, undoing whiteness, I'm like, yeah, like what is my lineage is this ethnicity, this culture based on in a land with practices and rituals and traditions. So that was like an important part of that process for me. But also I think it was being, as I've mentioned, like in spaces with other people, Jewish people in the psychedelic world, and hearing how so many people have experiences of intergenerational Jewish trauma, of being in spaces not supported, not having Jewish supported spaces, and of having a psychedelic experience and then disconnecting and me being like, wait, it didn't have to be that way. And then seeing others feel more connected. For me, like in literal ways, I like light candles every Friday now, or like there's just touch point. I've always kind of been connected with Shabbat, but I would say that like my relationship with Shabbat shifted a lot. I read it's definitely connected me more, but I can't say it's like just one thing. It's like as
Right.
I've gotten older and different things have shifted, but it's given me a lens, like, to reading Torah, like it definitely gave me a renewed inspiration during the pandemic, I like was working on improving my Hebrew so I could read Torah straight, from the source, and like being interested,
Right.
especially around the plant medicines and other things, but like feeling called to be more like directly engaged. But yeah, I would say in a word, yes, but probably the most profound way is by the community I've been lucky enough to co-create of like Jewish psychedelic world, and all of the amazing people I've met through that have taught me a lot and have kind of helped me reconnect in different ways too.
Yeah, it makes sense. The ayahuasca ceremonies, peyote ceremonies, like seeing the way these are practiced, the sacredness, the richness of the tradition, the way things are kind of passed down, and that kind of gave me an appreciation for, let's say the Shabbos ceremony or other stuff around it. Like without the sacred elements attached to it, it's almost impossible to sustain these.
Or it gets sustained based on other things that lose that kind of spiritual, magical
Right.
sacredness. Yeah.
Like a lot of people have asked me, because I think as part of this Jewish trauma response, like very afraid of anything else. Oh, if I desire, right? Everything is like, it's idol worship, it's different, So we can be very comfortable with our own kind of spirituality, but very threatened by someone else's.
Yeah.
Like it scares us. And so I'll say, like, okay, if I'm doing ayahuasca is one thing, but it's to be an ayahuasca ceremony. And what I'll answer now, I've answered different things at different points. Sometimes I'll just say, well, that's the first thing that could be healed when you take ayahuasca. But this craziness. But what else? If I feel like the answer coming generally is that, how could they have preserved something and fought to preserve something? Imagine these indigenous tribes in the middle of the Amazon, which are being, drawn through all sorts of powerful ways. Hey, there's more money here, there's more safety, there's more comfort, there's more opportunity. But no, I'm going to stay in this little area to protect my way of life. You have to use terms like, hey, this is sacred, this is holy, this is spiritual, this is God's desire, right? That's the only way someone's going to fight to protect these things.
True.
So then they come and say, hey, this is a very sacred plant, this is a very sacred medicine. First of all, it is. But second of all, without those, they can't just strip it apart and say, oh yeah, like this is a pretty cool tea. And yeah, we just somehow survived thousands of years. It's the same as Shabbos. Like why would people fight through so many different cultures and so many different battles to say, no, we're going to preserve this tradition for thousands of years. And now I think Shabbos makes sense to like everybody. Like literally everybody understands Shabbos at this point. It almost feels like Shabbos may have been created for this time in history. Just like, wow, you get like your whole family gets a day with no electronics and no travel, and just, wow, that's freaking awesome. Can I pop in for a few hours? It's like, sure, yeah.
I'm sure you know the book The Sabbath by Abraham Heschel. No?
I don't know it now.
Oh, it's a beautiful, really short meditation on Sabbath, but I've given that book to so many non-Jewish people who feel really connected to Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the beautiful things it talks about is how Shabbat is like a cathedral in time. And that's one of the most powerful tools as Jews. And we were exiled, expelled all over. We had this sacred time. So you don't need a space. You just need to be there. And it's sacred no matter what in this
Right.
period. And so that I just loved like thinking about that in terms of time and preservation, and also how what you're talking about, like people fought so hard to preserve this literally sacred way of being. It's like a physical being instead of doing on Shabbat, just like to
Right.
be able to be. And yeah, it's
So
pretty
you can think of
powerful.
it literally as a medicine for humanity. And saying like, if we lose this, and we've definitely lost a lot. There are many different things that could have been very beneficial to us that just have been lost. They don't know
Erased.
that this plant can do this tradition can do that. We've lost it. Those people haven't.
Including in our Jewish
For-
lineages,
for
a
sure.
lot got pushed underground. A lot of the women's traditions.
Such as?
Well, did you know in the Middle Ages, like the whole concept of witches, like the caricature of a witch is based on an Ashkenazi Jewish woman with the hook nose and ears and so there were apparently a lot of Jewish women working with different plants and healing things that were accused of.
Witchcraft.
And then so that whole practice in Judaism got like very pushed down or erased and lost. Yeah, and Dracula was also a Jewish man, like blood-sucking children and hoarding money with the nose. I don't like. There's so many anti-Semitic tropes that are like so deeply ingrained that I'm only recently discovering. It's really charming, but yeah, there's a lot of traditions, and even in the Torah, you know, all the talk of like wiping out the Asherah poles. Do you know much about Asherah? There's beliefs that Asherah was like the wife of God, actually, like before Torah times. And in a lot of ancient Israelites, there were these Asherah, like women sculptures that were found in homes. And they're just like different practices that seemed part of this like pre-temple or Judaism. And then the Torah talks about like wiping out all of the Asherah. So it's like kind of wiping out the women's practices and the oral traditions when the Torah kind of shifted to the written and more like accessible for kind of the male experience. That's a whole other trippy thing to get into, but I will plant the seed on Asherah that I'm sure you can have a more educated guest on that topic. It's just super interesting, and she's connected with cannabis. So I actually have had that's how I got interested. That vision I was talking about, I got high, and then I like kind of started hearing things about Asherah. I was like, what? Okay. Like, and I kind of started exploring this beautiful tradition in the region of this, goddess. And, you know, there's El, and there's a lot of interesting mythology that goes back pre-Torah, and it's not that, you know, there's just a lot to explore. That's all. I'll leave it at that. I don't need to go too deep into that right now.
We'll explore. We are in search of more.
Great title, by the way.
What the
In search of more. Very Jewish. Always more. Always how can we make things better? Which I don't know if you find that. Like I see as almost resistant sometimes to like non-Jewish people find like, why are you always like scratching the surface? Why are you always trying to like fix something or change it? Or I feel like our imperative of like tikkun olam, where it's, you know, being based on this world and not just the world after. It's like
it still hasn't been perfected, so we keep
we're
going.
trying to just make it better.
So I saw recently, so you know Yisro, Jethro, right?
No.
He's Moshe's father-in-law, Moses' father-in-law. His name was Yisro.
Oh, from the Torah.
From
I
the
thought it was like
Torah,
a
yeah.
person right now.
Oh, okay, sorry. I thought I was in the Torah.
Yes.
So his name, it happened to many Jews. Like Abraham was Abram, and then he became Abraham because that's adding a hey in Hebrew, which hey is God, right? One of the letters of God. So it's like once he found God, so his name changed, right? So there's many examples of this. So Yisro was Yeser, which Yeser means more. So someone shares me recently. So he was someone who kind of kept looking for more, and they say he studied every religion and he understood every religion on the planet, and then eventually he became. It said when Moses took the Jews out of Egypt, and they were attacked by Amalek, so the Amalekites. So Yisro heard about this. At times his name was Yeser, Jethro. So he heard about this, and he said, "Okay, I'm going to join the Jewish people. They need me." So he went to join. And at that point in time, here was a person who understood well all of the religions. Like he was in search of more, but eventually he said, like, no, this is the one. And once he said so, it wasn't until Yisro came and said, this is the one, that God was able to give the Torah. Like it needed that. That was a pivotal event in the, so the search for more on his side. So he got the letter Vav added to him. So instead of Yeser, the letter Vav, which Vav is like a long Yud, it's like drawing. So Yud is also God, and the vav is like drawing down God, right? So it's like bringing it into the world. So he got that out of Tim. So the search for more eventually becomes, like in his case, it became like a search for God, eventually, a search for light, a search for,
The ground,
bringing down the yud.
vav, yeah.
Right, taking down that yud and bringing it down. So anyway,
Thank you for sharing that.
just a
It's
thought, but someone shared it
beautiful.
with me.
I didn't know that.
Someone shared it with me a couple of weeks ago, and kind of like this whole, like the podcast, which eventually, I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew that there was something like in here that had to come out. So it was the microphone, and then it started with webinars, and eventually, okay, we'll do it as a podcast. We had a name, and several months ago we had a healing house. I don't know if you've...
I was just
come across-
learning a little bit about that. It sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's a few minutes away from here. We call it the House of More. So a couple of weeks ago, I felt like we need like an umbrella, something to kind of hold this stuff, the House of More and In Search of More, and wherever more takes us. So we called it. It was just after I heard this whole thing about Yisro and the more to, bring that. So we called it More to Ma'or. Ma'or in Hebrew is light. Ma'or.
Ma'or.
Ma'or, light. So more to Ma'or, right? That we're in search of more, but eventually the search for more should be just like Yisro's search for more, eventually to bring down God into the world.
It's beautiful.
So search for light.
It's very powerful. And it's really cool. They're all kind of building together to create more light and more connection, more bridging.
Yes, may it be. And just one thought on the shows. I've shared this before, but not everyone watches every podcast. And this is a conversation first, podcast second. So, like this whole idea of the Jewish, like the chosen people. So a thought I've had is that, yes, we are chosen, but to say we're chosen and other people aren't chosen is like it's saying there's something extra in God's world, which can't be, right? So we're chosen to let everyone know that they're chosen too, right? Because that's the message, meaning we're a thorn in everyone's side saying we're chosen. Why does it drive people crazy so much? Because if we're chosen, so are you. Like how can meaning there's only two real viewpoints for the world. Either there is a God who cares about everything, what is small and what is big. I mean, like, I don't know, the person who mistreated Hitler, like, could have been thought he was doing something small, and then it turned out big. Later, just one kid, yeah, just one. Now we got a problem on our hands, right? So, and the same, whatever. There's different versions of the Talmudic story of how Jesus came to be, but that's also part of it, right? So sometimes one can be pretty big. So obviously everything is big, right? So that's the viewpoint. Everything is chosen. Everything is purposeful. You mentioned the Baal Shem Tov, some of his teachings. There isn't a blade of grass that doesn't grow without a spirit saying grow, right? What is it? A leaf doesn't fall from a tree. I think he says like the amount of rotations a leaf makes when it falls from the tree to the ground, like that too is determined by God, right? Like that's a big part of people. Like every single detail is very, 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 very important, which wasn't completely the Jewish view. There were many other Jewish philosophers which said God's is kind of hands off. He worries about the big things. The Baal Shem Tov was like, no, everything is the big thing. Like all these little details. Everything. Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's the message of the Jew, is to say we are chosen. And then it bothers people because then we're saying you are chosen, which means you have a purpose, you have a mission. It's not random, it's intentional. And then the hope is that every single person kind of brings that message to them and say, I'm chosen, right? And we're starting to see it more with some of these medicines, which are, like, to me, I can't imagine my life without these medicines. And I'm so grateful to these tribes which fought for thousands of years to preserve them. And I know that I literally bumped into peyote accidentally a little bit ago. And I'm like, my life is different since this thing. This thing's like blew my heart open, and I did a lot of medicine before, but there was something that it has inside. You sit for 12 hours with that guy pounding the drum on peyote medicine, something happens to your heart. And I'm like, wow, I'm so grateful for these people for taking medicine. I know there's more. I know there's more of these things out there, and there's more of these like medicines and ways that, yeah, their parents told them you were chosen. That's what they said. Like, you were chosen for this. It's not an accident. You were born into this, and fight like hell to preserve our ways. And a lot of what we're missing is that there are a lot of people who weren't able to do that. They weren't able to communicate to their children their chosenness, and we've lost a lot.
Totally.
And hopefully we can get that message out there. That
thank you so much for sharing that, because I mean that's such a beautiful resonant way of seeing it, and it's something that's painful to me because I feel like both a lot of non-Jews and a lot of Jews actually see that as this like chosenness, that's this horrible thing, and da-da. But I really appreciate your framing because I do think it's more complex than what it sounds like. It's not chosen over other people. It's
Correct.
like we're about the connection to the other, like, the light unto nations. It's about the other nation. It's not about staying insular and just being chosen to be like sit around by ourselves and tell each other we're chosen. It's just so far from what that means. And the idea of being chosen, being a mirror to force other people to understand their own chosenness
Yes.
and their purpose, their tikkun, is such a profound gift if we're able to do that. So.
Right, if you're able to withstand the rocks thrown at you and someone. And it also, I think, explains why someone would be so annoyed at the Jew, because that message is just so frustrating. Why? I just want to have pleasure. I just want to enjoy life. I want to believe that there is nothing further for me to do than worry about my immediate pleasure and satisfaction.
Or that there's nothing I can do to make change in this world, so I might
Sure.
as well just do X, Y, Z and get to the next world, and don't tell me.
Or there is no next world.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people in the world do think there's a next world that they're kind of just like working, at least Christianity has
Right,
taught
sure.
a lot around that. Stuff is shifting. But I do want to quickly say about peyote, because it sounds like it was a really beautiful, powerful experience for you, that a lot of the Native American folks who I've worked with who are part of the Native American church who work with peyote, they are really
Against anyone else.
Well, I would describe it as worried about the scarcity of peyote in the U.S. And it is different than even like the huichol in Mexico. There's more abundant peyote growing, and they have different feelings about it. But just for context, one peyote bun, you probably know this, takes like 8 to 10 years to grow. Mm-hmm. So, and the Native American church, they only work with peyote grown in certain land and certain lineages. So it's really a scarce resource that way. And it's so sacred that, I've seen people at Burning Man, like pop some peyote with some tequila and so I think that's really difficult for people to see. So
But if you're going to call the Jews out for a trauma response and being secluded, so call the Native Americans out as well for it. Well, that's a disagreement in their community as well.
Absolutely.
Just like it is within the Jewish community.
Absolutely. And it's not about not using it. In fact, what I was going to share is just about
using
encouraging people to approach it with sacredness, with people who have lineage with it and understanding where it's coming from, and just know it's a serious thing that some people have different feelings about. There's also mescaline. Huachuma, which also contains, or San Pedro, which also contains mescaline. So there's just other opportunities, but like also hearing what you're sharing, clearly this medicine was like meant to reach you and sit with you and heal you. But it also sounds like you approached it with a lot of respect and intention. And so I just feel the need to like explain that about peyote, because it's actually the only like plant medicine that when we work on like decriminalization campaigns, we exclude peyote just out of respect for the Native American church, because that's their request. But as you said, and as I said, like also other communities share peyote more, especially in Mexico, not in the U.S. So there's all different answers.
Yeah, actually, one of the gentlemen I sat with was from the Mexican. I didn't know those details, but I did know that within their church there is kind of that divide, which I saw very similar to the Jewish divide. Very similar, let's say Jewish, let's say with the Hasidic divide, right? Where I grew up Chabad, which has decided to share its
light.
There was a lot of metaphors within like Chabad, a lot of like stories told and analogies. And one of the primary analogies for the teaching of Chabad, teaching of Chabad teachings, which is actually, a lot of it is taking Kabbalah, mystical concepts, and making it very accessible. So an analogy that was given was that there was a king who had a son who was very, very sick. And a doctor came and he said to the king, he said, I can heal your son, but there's only one thing that has a chance of healing your son. And that's the jewel on the what is it called?
The crown.
On the crown of the king, like has a potential to heal your son. That's all. If we crush it up and, turn it into some sort of potion for your child, it can heal your child. But it may not work, and you'll be losing your stone. And, and obviously the king made a decision to do that. And that's kind of like the analogy that was always given to us when we were younger about what happened with the Chabad teachings and the Chabad choice to not be insular with its ways, but to share. Not for the Chabad teachings, it was like for the Chabad teachers, right? A lot of mystics had these ideas. They knew these things, and they were passing it around in underground. And okay, this guy's holy enough. Let me teach him this. And then this way, like the Baal Shem Tov, and then obviously through the Chabad lineage, just more and more and more and more till the seventh Rebbe, the Rebbe just kind of exploded with this, and just to bring these messages out everywhere. Knock on office doors and offer people, tefillin and Shabbos candles and the mystical teachings behind it and all of it. Just let it rip. Was that crushing of the crown jewel with the hope that there may be a chance that enough gets into the child to heal them. So I kind of see it the same way with a lot of these medicines. Yes, there's no question that when ayahuasca was brought out of the jungle, and amongst those natives who for thousands of years were taught to cherish it and protect it, yes, it was disrespected in some way. And no question with peyote also is disrespected in some way. But my perspective is that if it took a guy eating some chips with tequila at Burning Man in order for me to get some, I'm grateful for that guy eating chips with tequila.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'll share along those lines that ayahuasca is interesting because even though, I do suspect it was used for thousands of years, there's actually proof that it's only been used a few hundred years. It doesn't go back as far as a lot of the other practices. And ayahuasca really got more popularized and spread around by these syncretic churches that were kind of a mix of Christianity and indigenous traditions. So it's that tradition was able to kind of adapt to some of the colonial pressures and survive by mixing stuff together. And so it's just an interesting way of that being one of the most commonly, the one that kind of made it around. In my mind, It almost feels like it was, and it's a vine snaking around. And, as I explore around the world, there's so many psychoactive plant traditions that are still super secret and not shared around, not shared outside of cultures. But in terms of the crushed up diamond metaphor, which is so beautiful, what I've understood from those cultures where they're not sharing the sacred plant, but they are trying to crush up the diamond and share the teachings.
Right,
and
exactly.
What is the wisdom? They believe that it would lose its sacredness and its power maybe if that actual plant was shared, or it's too dangerous. But then what is the message that gets out from there? I was hiking around Mount Sinai. Sinai is one of the most special places to me. And we hiked for hours in this wadi to find a Bedouin plant healer who we were asking about different plants that, were mentioned in the Torah and different things around. And it took him at first he said, oh, no, you can't consume that. It doesn't exist anymore. And we sat for a while with my Egyptian friend who speaks Arabic. And only after this man, who's so sweet, he had made us this whole meal with his fresh garden outside. He lives hours away from anyone else. He went out after probably an hour of talking, took some time, I don't know, it must have been convenient having some practice. It came back inside and all of a sudden changed his whole gave us a bag of the leaves to smoke and was be careful with this, but it's really not, it's we had to build trust with him and rapport. He also, when he came back in, started
kind of
asking.
Like someone trying to become a convert in Judaism,
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And that was even easier than most situations, just an hour of conversation. Sure. But it just gives you he was so
once you
giving.
had an Egyptian friend, it was just an hour of conversation.
Exactly. And this Egyptian friend is a very spiritually connected friend, does not, it's someone that this person actually ended up asking if he would want to learn with him, which was a really big deal. So it wasn't an easy thing overall, but yeah, I think that sacredness, with Kabbalah, you're supposed to be 40, married, and there's certain limitations that Judaism creates to help people be grounded, that vav to the earth when you're extending out into this mystical other practice. So that is something I think about with all of these medicine practices. Like, what is our kavanah, like container that helps ground us and connect us in a way so that we don't get like uprooted in a way that's unhelpful.
100%. Yeah, what I would say, in business, because there's a part of my life where I practice that, one of the, I don't know, the techniques maybe of managing a business is you'll build inherent tensions into the system, right? Meaning you want that tension there because within that tension, you'll kind of get to the truth. So, for example, you'll have a sales department which you want to be fairly aggressive, and a finance department which you want to be fairly conservative, right? And you kind of push them against each other. And they each have to play their role, but when we step back, it's like they're both needed for each other. I kind of think it's like, I'll tell you, like the progressive movement and the conservative movement. And it's like, if only they understood what? That we have to change everything under the sun? No, that's crazy. That we shouldn't change anything? That's also crazy. Right? You're trying to build an inherent tension in the system where one person just wants to change everything, always, just for the fun of being progressive. The other person wants to hold on to their traditions because that's the way grandpa did it. And even though now there's an internet and cars and all these other changes, like, no, this is the way we got to do it. And it's not that one is right, one is wrong. It's that between the two of them, that tension will get us to the right place. And I think the same is true with these medicines. Is, we need a voice that's like, don't share it with anyone. And we need another voice that's like, no, we got to bring it out there. And then they kind of force each other to bring it out as responsible as possible.
Totally. That tension to me also feels like a very deep Jewish teaching. And, also what I've learned about Chavrusa is like the kind of most high, like holy, sacred version of that is when there is a tension and there are two people who actually have a different perspectives, because the truth is the back and forth and the push and pull, and there isn't just one like stagnant truth. And that's something I've just always so deeply connected with as this spiritual teaching of this back and forth, that tension, and also holding space for duality and holding space for more than one perspective. That is getting increasingly rare in our world right now, where you're either this or that. And it's so difficult to be doing bridging work when people are so stuck in one camp. But this beautiful tension that you describe, it's like, not only is it necessary, but it like literally helps create space. You get, without tension and back and forth, you're not like moving and growing and expanding. So that's like the core of expansion, is that back and forth.
It's like you give a car a gas and brake, right? Both. If you gave it one or the other, you wouldn't move or you'd die.
Yeah. It's also like, what people like to call feminine, masculine energies, or yin and yang. Like, we need that balance of the going and the reflecting and the resting, and it's
100%,
not that easy to find that balance always and everything, but it's helpful to think in those terms.
Right. Yeah, that's what we can get stuck in the right and wrong. There's a beautiful quote by Rumi. He says, out beyond right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I will meet you there.
I've seen that.
So he didn't say it in English, but that's the way the quote is.
But how powerful is his work that we're all still quoting him thousands of years, or 1,000 years maybe later. It's pretty extraordinary. And that when you're like, we're operating on that level of like spiritual connectivity, it just resonates with everyone. And that's such a light. Like, if you can like channel that kind of knowledge,
Right. My understanding is that there was a time where these Jewish philosophers and others were kind of going back and forth with each other, like the Sufis, like that Sufism, that part of Islam, right, is kind of like the mystical part of Islam, and Judaism, they have the same. And I think there were periods in history where a lot of the well-known Jewish philosophers, I think the Rambam had a lot of correspondence with other.
A lot in North Africa, Spain, Portugal, that kind of era.
It wasn't this us versus them. There was like, there's a richness and beauty there, and there's a richness and beauty here, and let's share the ways.
And, my prayer is that we can continue moving back towards that direction. I am parts of different interfaith communities working on that process, but it's really a shame that that's the exception rather than the rule right now. So I do hope that we can, as we start to kind of connect more to this spiritual holistic approach, it opens up space to connect with other traditions and see how similar the tenets of almost all of these religions and traditions are. And like the things that differ don't have to be a source of contention, you know? They can be like, okay, cool, that's your way, this is our way, and we're actually saying the same thing for the most part, like, you know?
Right. So just we'll end on this note. You had mentioned before our conversation about either some research or something you were involved with between Israelis and Palestinians sitting together with ayahuasca.
Yeah.
So what have you learned? Meaning, so were you part of the research, or were you?
I developed a study where we interviewed Palestinians and Israelis who were sitting in ayahuasca ceremonies together.
Okay.
And this was a few years ago now, and we learned a lot of beautiful things. I'll say, firstly, it was a different community of Jewish Israelis that were part of it, because Jewish Israelis have a lot of access to ayahuasca circles. So the ones who chose these circles were a self-selecting group who were like, I want to sit with Palestinians and do this work. The Palestinians at the time, there were very few opportunities to sit in ayahuasca ceremony. So granted, they also were self-selecting that they're even doing ayahuasca and tend to be more open, but many of them said, sure, if we had been able to go with an all-Palestinian group, that would have been awesome also.
Right.
But, this was what was available. And people sat with each other, and there were singing in Arabic of the Quran and singing Hebrew prayers, and a lot of shared intergenerational trauma being processed, where like a Jewish Israeli said that like he experienced being on like in a house in Lebanon where an Israeli soldier like broke into the house, and he was like sitting on the side of the Lebanese person watching this Israeli, and they're just their eyes in there, with a gun aimed at them, and had this whole really difficult experience in that way.
An Israeli person said that.
Yeah.
Okay. So
they were like, and then a Palestinian participant in one of the ceremonies said he had the opposite, where he experienced being behind the gun of a like young Israeli, feeling so scared and like aiming at a Palestinian kid, and just feeling all of the tensions and like how horrible that was, and like that made him really sick to like feel that. And people have short stories about also shifting after having these experiences to like. One Israeli said that Arabic, because of your experiences in Israel, you're trained to think Arabic is like a dangerous thing. Like when you hear Arabic, your body like tenses up, like you're afraid of it. And so they said hearing Arabic sang in such a beautiful, powerful way in the middle of ceremony allowed them to completely release that and like see it for what it was, and see all the fear put on, and connect to the beauty of Arabic. And actually after this ceremony, this Jewish Israeli guy started studying Arabic and like learning and deepening that process. So that was like a cool story. But a lot of people, I'd say, like a lot of people talked about the music. A lot of people actually spoke about reconnecting to their own religions in a more spiritual way and less dogmatic way, which was really cool. There are a lot of people also, not a lot, but some people had some pretty intense and powerful visions about the future, like Temple Mount Jerusalem kind of visions, some with a lot of violence, some with rainbows. We've like published all the study and like all these interviews. But I would say as a whole, the ceremonies were not there. Like people didn't go to like make peace. They went to do healing work, and they happened to be in this joint space. And in that process, when you're healing in such vulnerable space with each other, it does create really intimate connections that you might not, you're in such a vulnerable state, helping someone process something so traumatic that creates a really special kind of community. So that was something that seemed to kind of come up, that like just what that healing process meant. But a lot of, especially the Jewish Israelis, said that they felt more material kind of emerge that was relevant to the trauma of the land and relationships with Palestinians that came up in those ceremonies than maybe in other ceremonies.
Right.
But yeah, it's work I believe in both on the individual and the joint levels, just like the more collective healing that Palestinians and Israelis and Jews can have around what's been happening in the land and even before. I really think that's one of our best tools to like looking forward and building from a place that doesn't continue to create more trauma and violence.
Right. Yeah, I think just seeing the commonality between struggles. You know, Rudy Rahman shared something that can make your head spin a little bit. He said, and I don't know I don't know what the source for this data is, but he believes about 40 to 50% of Palestinians living in Gaza are of Jewish descent. Right?
So I have no idea what the stats are, but I know from my friends that I have a few friends who are Palestinian who have they have Ashkenazi ancestry, like DNA, like significant
Right.
amounts. So that doesn't surprise me at all. 40, 50 sounds high, but
Right.
that I do believe that if we were all living in this land for a long time, we are really the same people in different communities and practices. So it doesn't surprise me. And I do wish there was more of an openness to that exploration and understanding, not even just genetically, but like we were like living in this land together for so long. And, even from our biblical stories, right, there's belief that we're brother, like with Ishmael, like,
Oh yeah, 100%.
so
Yeah,
it's
going
like
back
there's
for
so
sure.
much built into that teaching. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd love to ask Rudy about those numbers because it's kind of an impossible thing to have a stat on because no one's doing these genetic tests in Gaza
Yeah, I'm not sure
right now.
I'm not sure where it came from. So I said,
But if it's from his spirit and that, I don't think he's totally wrong. And there's so much, like in South America, tracing, like I don't know if you've seen those genetic tracings of a lot of South Americans who actually have like Jewish ancestry from Spanish Inquisition
definitely makes
times.
sense that there would be. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you have a people which are older than Islam, older than Christianity, and 1/100th the size of either of them. So, yeah, it makes sense that a lot of us got lost in a lot of different places.
Totally.
So, all right, thank you so much, Natalie. Appreciate you coming out.
Thank you so much.
And I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope many people benefit from it.
Amen. This is so beautiful and wide-ranging. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it.